Shalom, everyone. It's an honor and a privilege to be here today. I want to thank Brian Birch for inviting me to participate on this panel. Every opportunity to talk about Mormons and Jews is a sacred opportunity for me, so I really am appreciative of the opportunity to be here. I'd like to start by honoring the Jewish community for its welcoming of Mormons in its midst. This is the community that when you reach out to it, it reaches back. This is the community that reaches back, and let me give you an example. Many of you who are not from Southern California may not be aware that, for instance, there are Mormons working at the Jewish Federation. There's one employee who's been there for 10 years. 3 Mormons have worked at the Israeli consulate. And I might add that the consul general who hired them had such a positive experience. He's now the Israeli ambassador to Australia, and he's hired 2 Mormons there. A Mormon has emceed the Israel Festival, which is the nation's largest, 3 times. The church has held major receptions at the Jewish Federation and at the Israeli consulate. The church had a booth this year at the Israeli festival. It was the only non-Jewish organization, or certainly faith group, allowed to have a booth at the Israel festival. A Mormon has conducted the bilingual Yom HaZikaron, the Israeli Memorial Service community for Israelis in Los Angeles. Mormons discuss LDS theology in synagogues and schools. In fact, there's an ultra-Orthodox school, a very prominent one in Los Angeles, that just hired a Mormon teacher. Rabbis speak in stake centers. We just had a rabbi also speak at a meeting of the BYU Management Society. There's an LDS Jewish theological dialogue that has been going on for 2 years between a stake president and a prominent conservative rabbi. Last year we sent 5 rabbis to Utah. They had a marvelous experience. I'll reference that a little bit later. To what can we attribute this success? We've clearly had more success in Southern California reaching out to Jews than Latter-day Saints have had anywhere else in the world. And there's one word for it: synergy. Mormons at all levels in Southern California have contributed to the success of these efforts. They've made outreach to local Jewish communities a priority. The church's Regional Public Affairs Committee established a Jewish Relations Committee 5 years ago, and in doing so they built on the work of the church's really legendary former public affairs spokesman here, Keith Atkinson. He started reaching out to the Jewish community formally about 20 years ago, and we're riding on the backs of giants today. Stake presidents, and I see President Lamb here, I want to thank him for coming, have supported holding firesides, Passover Seders, and other events to promote a greater understanding of Judaism here. The mission president, we've convinced 2 mission presidents now to invite rabbis to speak to missionaries about Judaism. Mormons have signed up to teach for Korei LA, which is run by the Jewish Federation. It's the largest literacy program in the city for children, and we have Mormons teaching for Jews. Actually, most of their students are Latinos in California, so there's a great synergy working there. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have the active support of the Public Affairs Department in Salt Lake City, and we're very grateful for that. So synergy is what makes this work. Now, also on sort of the micro level, the nature of our communities really helps. One thing that we've realized here is that we are a hierarchical organization reaching out to probably the most non-hierarchical organization that there is in the religious world. So the beauty of this is that every time a Jew meets a Mormon, he doesn't assume at all. In fact, he never assumes that the Mormon is speaking on behalf of the church. Mormons are really concerned about that. Mormons are hyper-concerned, in my opinion, far too much concerned with whether what comes out of their mouth will be perceived by anyone listening as the official position of the church. Jews don't think that way. So the beauty of that is it opens us up to reach out to Jews across the spectrum. And I hasten to add, as I see Catholic leaders here, that hierarchies are important sometimes, and certainly when you're dealing with hierarchies, it is important to reach out to hierarchies. But when reaching out to Jews, we don't have to take that into consideration normally. There is a time for formal involvement. For instance, when the AJC has a yearly Hanukkah ceremony, it's a beautiful ceremony, they request an official representative of the church to attend. But we can engage them across the board with Reform Jews, and Rabbi Greenebaum is a Reform rabbi. They are very interested in interfaith dialogue. Where it's harder to reach out to them is on issues, for example, that the Orthodox would feel more comfortable working with us on, namely abortion, pornography, gay marriage. So the Reform don't see eye to us on many what we would call moral issues, family issues. But if you're talking about interfaith dialogue, Reform rabbis will invite you to speak in their synagogues. They'll invite you to work on service projects with them. They'll come and speak in your stake. And then you have the Orthodox. And I have to say that we have had phenomenal success reaching out to the Orthodox here. There was an Orthodox rabbi who actually he called me just the other day to tell me proudly that in his synagogue a few weeks ago, he got up and talked about the book of Joshua, which some Mormon, actually there are many academics here, you may know that Mormons helped bring about the translation of the book of Joshua. He talked about how important it was to Mormons in an Orthodox synagogue. When we held a Prop 8 town meeting, we held it at one of the leading Orthodox synagogues in the city because they felt it was so important. I will hasten to add that many Mormons have expressed their frustration to me about reaching out to the Orthodox on a personal level. You know, the Orthodox in general are interested right now in partnering with people like with organizations like the LDS Church, the Catholic Church on moral issues. But to reach out to Orthodox rabbis on a personal level, there's really no secret. You just really, really have to be interested in Judaism. You have to be willing to go to a lecture on Christmas Eve day on Dina de Malkuta Dina, on Jewish law. You have to be willing to spend a Friday and part of a Thursday going to a conference on the laws of kosher. Unless you're willing to do that, it's hard really to establish a relationship with Orthodox leaders on a personal level, but on a macro level, they are willing to partner with us. But even more importantly than partnering with movements within Judaism, we have partnered with individual organizations. And the reason we can do that again is because there's no expectation that the people we ask to go to those events are representing the church. I'll give you an example that is very dear to my heart. I have a very good friend who was a ranger in Afghanistan. He was in my ward. And I found out that JINSA was sponsoring an event. Now, JINSA is a very right-wing organization that promotes military ties between Israel and the United States. It's highly unlikely that the Southern California Public Affairs Council would ever co-sponsor an event with JINSA. But I took him to a JINSA event, and they had a general speaking from the Pentagon. When he found out who he was, he called him up, had him lead the Pledge of Allegiance, and he spent time talking about what his particular battalion had done in Afghanistan. He was the head of JINSA, and in fact, he formally joined the organization. Now, just because the church can't co-sponsor an event with JINSA doesn't mean that there aren't Mormons who are interested in JINSA. I have sent Mormons to Peace Now meetings and events. There are Mormons who are of an ideological bent that they would feel comfortable joining Peace Now or J Street or other organizations on the left. They're not representing the church, but they're engaging with the Jewish community. Jews see that Mormons are interested in what they're interested in. Vista Del Mar is another wonderful organization that works with autistic kids and it works with problem kids. There are many Mormons in our community who would love to partner with Vista Del Mar. And in fact, I've had two friends who have gone with me to their events. There actually is a secret to all of this that I haven't told you. On our Jewish Relations Committee, and whenever we look for people to really help us establish relations with Jews, they are people with a profound love for Jews. Let me tell you, this isn't in my talk, but let me just go through briefly, tell you a sentence or two about the people on our committee. It's headed by Fred Huckvale, who at his own expense went in the 90s and he and his company built housing for Russian immigrants who were coming to Israel. That's how strongly he felt about helping Jews. We have J.D. and Rachel Payne, and in fact J.D. Payne is right here. They're a couple who spent their honeymoon in Israel, and his wife, who is a trained opera singer, now sings in the choir of VBS, Valley Beth Shalom, which is one of the leading conservative synagogues in the country. Dennis Williams is a former bishop who has lectured on LDS Jewish relations for decades. And Chris McConklin teaches, actually, at the American Jewish University. These are all people with a profound love for Jews, and Jews can feel it. And so there's another dynamic that goes on. If we're talking about formally reaching out to Jews and informally reaching out to Jews, almost all of the invitations we get to deal with Jews are personal invitations. They're not invitations because, oh, we need a representative from the Church's Public Affairs Council, so Mark, would you mind doing this? It's JD, we know you love us, would you mind coming to this event? Almost all the invitations we get, even though we have a formal committee, are personal ones. They're not institutional invitations. And if you haven't seen by now, given the other people on our committee, I'm the slacker in the bunch, so I apologize for... Whenever possible, I try to dialogue with Jews and to work with Jews where it's just Jews and Mormons. I think Interfaith organizations are wonderful things, and I'm certainly glad the church is active in multi-faith environments, but I think that wherever possible, we should be dialoguing with Jews. We have more success, and I think that we have things to say to them that other faith communities do not. Imagine a talk about the mission of Elijah, or smicha, the laying out of hands, or the Abrahamic covenant. I think that we have things to tell them that other people don't, and vice versa. We have a lot of positives. We bring a lot of positives to the relationship. Number one, we have no history of institutional anti-Semitism. Jews generally think of Mormons as having a great love for Jews and Judaism and Israel. And I can tell you that love can cover a multitude of sins when you're reaching out to them. Inevitably, you make mistakes, you say things you shouldn't, you do things you shouldn't, and because they know you love them, it sort of wipes away a lot. It's the process of repentance, in the tshuva in the Jewish community. The church's policy of neutrality is inspired, and it really helps us out, because once you take Mideast politics off the table, we can use our background to bring people together. I'm thinking specifically of a case not too long ago where a prominent Muslim journalist died. He was also a friend of the Jewish community, and they were looking for someone to conduct his memorial service. Well, the Muslims didn't want a Jew, and the Jews weren't wild about the idea of a Muslim, but they said, since he's Muslim, we might as well have a Muslim do it. So they asked a Mormon to do it. And I got to officiate at the ceremony for Tashbi Sayyid. He's a wonderful man. Now, we do face a few challenges, as any two communities do when they reach out to each other. We do have a few challenges when we reach out to Jews. Number one, and number two, and number three is the fear of conversion, which Rabbi Greenebaum has already addressed. It's very serious. When JD's wife, when we first called her, I wanted her to meet with a senior official from the Jewish Federation, a wonderful woman. And she spent half the time at the luncheon telling Rachel that it was very important that she not even give the appearance of wanting to convert Jews. She spent a lot of time at the luncheon simply pressing that point. It's hard to overemphasize how important this is, and if there's any suspicion at all that you are reaching out to Jews to convert them, then you will be completely ineffective in what you do. There's also an internal challenge to reaching out to Jews. From a public affairs viewpoint, you need to be flexible. I know that public affairs likes you to turn in a budget in November with all of the events you're going to attend, how much they're going to cost. You can't do that with the Jewish community. Thankfully, we have understanding leaders. We didn't know that we were going to get a booth at the Israel Festival until 2 weeks before. They just extended the invitation spontaneously. If we had not budgeted for it, but we needed to do that. It was a very important thing to do. The Jewish community itself doesn't know which events are going to happen next year. I mean, it may know one or two of the big ones, but there's no Jewish organization that knows exactly how many events it's going to have next year. So if you're trying to budget and plan, you need to have a great deal of flexibility with the Jewish community because it's so dynamic. Now, one side benefit to reaching out to Jews, I know we're going to be talking about reaching out to evangelicals. It has helped us individually in our relationships with evangelicals. Now, we have to be careful, though, because it's very important that we distinguish ourselves from evangelicals when it comes to reaching out to Jews. For those of you who don't know, evangelicals are, and I hate to generalize, there are many evangelicals who are perceived to be, and in fact are, very anti-Islam. And we are certainly not. Let me give you an example. I'll give you two examples, one in this country, one in another country. When I worked at the consulate, I was asked by the consul general to gather several prominent, actually about 10 prominent evangelical pastors to talk about ways in which they could collaborate with the consulate. We actually had an agenda. It wasn't just a free-for-all. We had an agenda of events that were coming up. We had to end the event prematurely after a half hour because all the pastors wanted to do was slam Islam. That's all they wouldn't adhere to the agenda. They said, no, we want to tell you about Islam. The consul general stood up and said, this is ridiculous. We have many Muslim citizens of Israel, and I'm not going to listen to this anymore. And he never met with evangelical leaders as a group after that. Another example is Geert Wilders. How many of you have heard of Geert Wilders, the Dutch parliamentarian? Okay. Very anti-Islam, very pro-Jewish, but very anti-Islam. I met with a senior member of the European Jewish community when I was there last year. I asked him about Geert Wilders. He speaks around the U.S. as well. He said, Mark, give me 100 Muslims over Geert Wilders. Shocked me. I said, why would you prefer? He said, Mark, we could listen to him talk about Israel all day long, but the problem is he's so anti-Islam that he tries to do away with Muslim schools, Muslim slaughter or ritual slaughter practices. And when he does that, it affects us. So we're working with the Muslims, actually, to combat people like shared builders. Baptism for the dead. I have excellent news. First of all, let me start out with a disclaimer. Having been to Auschwitz, I can tell you that the Jews who are concerned about this issue are entitled to an explanation. I don't think that anyone who's been to a place like that would have the attitude of this Relief Society teacher. Having said that, and I'm glad that the church is giving them an explanation. Our church leaders have tried to work with them for many years. Having said that, I have very good news. It's completely irrelevant to our day-to-day outreach with the Jewish community. All of the things that I just explained to you about how we've been able to reach out to Jews, the success we've had, shows that there really is on a day-to-day level, it's an irrelevant issue. When I went to St. Louis a few months ago, one lady at the end of the question and answer session, there were 200 Jews there, and she asked the question, she said, I've heard about this baptism issue. Can you give me an update? I said, before I do, how many of you have heard of this issue? 2 other people raised their hands. I said, why don't you just come up afterwards and I'll talk to you. I'm not going to waste everyone's time by talking about this issue because nobody knows about it. If you believe it is important, I'll give you another example. The Museum of Tolerance is run by the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which has been a vocal critic of the church on the baptismal issue for many years. If you go to their genealogy exhibit, which we helped set up, you will find pamphlets distributed by the Family History Center, and it will tell you about the LDS Family History Center. It's not a deal breaker for Jews. There are some Jews who are concerned about the issue, and they're entitled to an explanation, and they get it. But it's irrelevant to our outreach efforts here, thankfully. We live in an era when Jews are being gathered to America and Israel. And there are people as you travel around who have a sense of urgency when it comes to reaching out to Jews. It's the only community discussed at this conference that's in danger. The Jews living in the Middle East, certain parts of Europe, are in danger. There are many parts of Europe where you can't walk around and openly dress as a Jew. When I travel and give speeches, I don't do so to hear myself speak. I do it at my expense because I think it's important. And I try to use the speeches as catalysts to bring Jews and Latter-day Saints together. I don't speak in a city unless they say that their goal is to bring Jews and Latter-day Saints together. I don't need to hear myself speak. I don't want it said that I stood by while Jews were threatened once again by individuals, groups, and governments that are every bit as anti-Semitic as those that were in power during World War II. We've talked about Orson Hyde, but the most important thing that Orson Hyde did was not to dedicate the land of Israel for the gathering of the Jews. That was very important. The most important thing that he did, and would to God that people had listened to him, was he went to Europe, and what did he do there? He told the Jewish leaders to leave, to go to Palestine. They didn't listen to him. If they had, history would have been very different. Certainly the history of the Jewish people would have been very different. Jews are natural coalition builders, and the possibilities are endless around the world for Latter-day Saints to reach out to them. In closing, I'd like to read a letter from one of the rabbis who went to Utah. He's one of the leading Talmudists in the country. He said, I want you to know I'm almost 75 years old, and for half a century I've been involved in all kinds of interfaith programs. And most of the time they are superficial. Everybody smiles and then says absolutely nothing of content and importance. You sort of congratulate yourself for doing the right thing and extending yourself, and that's really it. This was a totally distinct and unique experience for me in every sense of the word. And I want you to know that there was a feeling of honest brotherhood in all of these gatherings that I have never experienced before. There was a real spiritual connection that I felt. I know I felt it very, very strongly. I've been trying to analyze it, and the only conclusion I can come to is that there is a Jewish-Mormon connection. It is very real and very honest. It's that commonality of shared values and ideals. I also think it's a commonality of shared histories of persecution, but whatever it is, it was a feeling of such intimacy that I had, that we all had, that it was indescribable. It's a religious experience, to put it accurately. It was something unlike any sentiment I have had in half a century of this kind of work. The other meetings were in many ways not dishonest, but superficial. This was real, this was honest, this was God. And that, my friends, is what I wanted to share with you. Latter-day Saints and Jews are two peoples with a unique message chosen to spread the word. There are no Mormon monks and no Jewish monks. We both believe in engaging with the world, not hiding from it. Joseph Smith said, "Inasmuch as you feel interested for the covenant people of the Lord, the God of their fathers will bless you." And the last thing I have to say is I've discovered the secret of Jewish success. It was not long ago I was speaking to an audience like this in a Jewish retirement home. And I was speaking about a boycott of Israel that was being organized in England. And in the corner, way in the corner, was a man about 90 years old he was nodding off, and being a high counselor, I was used to that, so it didn't faze me. Barely lift his finger. I mean, the man was emaciated. So I left, and as I was leaving, he stopped me. He said, "Young man, would you mind coming over?" I said, "Yes, sir. What can I do for you?" He said, "I heard that people are planning to do something against Israel. Can you tell me what that is?" I explained to him what it was, and he looks at me and he said, this 90-year-old man, barely lift his finger, he says, "Then I have to do something." The day that Latter-day Saints are like that, I think, is the day when we'll have as much success as the Jews have had. I leave you with the blessing found in Deuteronomy, May you be blessed in the city and the field. Thank you.